Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
How did God use that story to launch you into ministry? I mean, it sounds like you had a pretty good job. It could have been very tempting for you to just, like you said, just be like, hey, my job is to make a lot of money and then I'll give it to missions. If you want to go into the story about how God kind of shut the door on the mission field, you can do that, but just, how did you take that next step of faith?
Well, I mean, I was sure of the Lord's calling me into ministry. I mean, when I was a student at Kent State, it was during my freshman year that I became a believer. And it was really through the scientific evidence. But I was studying chemistry and physics, and it was during my sophomore year that I really decided that I should choose one, chemistry or physics. And so during the winter break, I was walking in a field behind my parents' house, and I put before the Lord and I prayed. I asked the Lord, what should I dedicate my life to, chemistry or physics? And I heard China. And that wasn't one of the options. I honestly was not even expecting to hear anything, but it was very clear that, and so I just stopped and prayed. I said, if you're calling me to be a missionary to China, send me to China. So a few weeks later, I returned to Kent State to start the new semester. And a friend of mine who had led a Bible study when I was a freshman, he was a senior at that time. So I hadn't seen him in almost a year at this point. He came to visit me at Kent. And after we visited for the day, at the end of the day, he said, well, the real reason he came to see me is he had an opportunity to go to China that summer. And when he prayed about whether he should go, the Lord spoke to him and said that I was supposed to go with him. And so that was the confirmation that the Lord was calling me into the mission field. And so when we had, after my wife and I got married and I finished college, we were looking for opportunities to go to China. And so when the Faith Promise situation came up, we thought, okay, he took care of our debt, paid my parents back. He's cleared everything for us to go to China. And then my wife's visa was denied. And we were looking to go to China through OMF, where I would work in China as a chemist. But in that process, we end up praying, okay, what is the next step? We thought the next step was actually going to China. And separately, both my wife and I felt convicted that the Lord was calling us to move back to Kent. And so when we told our pastor that this is where we felt the Lord was leading us and we were going to move back to Kent, that week, the president of China Outreach Ministries called our pastor and asked him to pray that someone would start the ministry in Ohio at either Kent State, Akron, or Case Western. Those were their three targeted schools. And we knew people working with international students at Case Western and at Akron University, but we didn't know anyone working with international students at Kent. And we were both Kent alumni. And so we just felt like, yeah, this is what the Lord was calling us to. And so the Lord opened up that door, and January of 96, we joined China Outreach Ministries.
Wow. Yeah, and it was later that year that I joined the Navigators, and it took me a couple more years to get back to Kent State. But and I know when I came back to Kent State in the early 2000s, by that time you were hosting, like, there would be like hundreds of new Chinese students coming into campus, and you would host at your house in your yard, and your house was not that big. It certainly wasn't big enough to host a party of, uh, close to 100 people, but you would have several hundred students in your yard, feeding them, some of the very first Americans that they met were you and your wife and
Hmm.
people that served on your team. And it was exciting for me to just see that. And I know that I've heard
Hmm.
just many, stories through the years. But yeah, I mean, do you want to reflect on? So you joined China Outreach Ministries, which that's a pretty cool story too. That you didn't even know there was a Chinese outreach ministry, I'm guessing.
No, no. But our pastor in Canton, um, his first job as a pastor years before, he was the youth pastor and the choir director at another church. And then his senior pastor went on to become the president of China Outreach Ministries. And so he had that relationship um, with the president of China Outreach Ministries. And so
Okay.
that's why they called. And actually, yeah, Glenn Osborne was our pastor, and several years later, actually, Glenn Osborne became the next president of China Outreach Ministry. So our pastor later became our president
Oh, wow,
of
that's
the
cool.
ministry. So
That's
yeah.
really cool. So, tell me just in our time remaining, what were some of the other stories of faith? Let's keep the theme of faith going. Maybe like when you made that step, you moved back to Kent. Was there anything that happened in those first couple of years that comes to mind that you just answered prayer as you stepped out of faith? You know how God just continued to work around you.
Yeah, you mentioned the students coming to our house. A couple things to mention about that. When we first moved back to Kent, um, we rented a place, but we wanted to buy a house, and we looked at places close to campus and really concluded that we couldn't afford any place close to campus. And so we had tried buying a few houses, and they all fell through for one reason or another.
And
But
by the way, just a caveat here, because I've been in campus ministry, houses around campuses are very expensive. And a lot of that has to do with because they become rental houses, and so they become multi-income. They're investment properties. So there's a good reason why they're expensive, and it's very difficult to find an affordable house near campus. So anyway, continue on.
well, the house we ended up buying ends up it was owned by a student, and this is smart thinking by his father. His father said instead of paying rent, his father helped him go through the process of buying a house and said, while you're in college, pay the mortgage will be cheaper than the rent, and you have other students living with you. And so then when he finished college, he was ready to sell the house. But while he was a student, he became a believer also. And it's right next to campus, and he noticed that all how many Chinese students lived in the apartment complex there on Morris Road. And so we didn't know who this student was. He didn't know who we were. But the one week when our the one house we were looking to buy fell through, I just got a phone call out of the blue, and this guy said, "Hey, I'm Scott. I'm supposed to sell my house, and I think this would be a great place for ministry. I looked through the list of campus ministers, and you work with Chinese, and I think God wants you to have this house." I'm like, okay. So we went and looked at the house, and it's not the kind of house that we were looking at, but we had a list of all the things that we were looking for. And after looking at the house, I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure I like this house. And I just heard the Holy Spirit say, look at your list. And everything that was on our list that we were looking for, the backyard, and it 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 fit all our needs. And so we gave him an offer that was pretty far below market value. he countered with a lower offer,
Really?
which, yes. And he said he just felt convict convicted that the Lord wanted us to have that house. So when we met, so we met at the house and we discussed this. There was a knock at the door, and there was a Chinese lady at the door. And she said, I just arrived here from China. I don't know anybody. I need to find an apartment. Can somebody help me? And we said, okay. And so that day we helped her find an apartment. And Scott's like, yeah, see, God wants you to have this. This is be a good ministry house for the
Wow.
Chinese.
Now
And yeah,
that
she just
now if I was that guy's dad, I I I might be a little upset that he lowered how often do you hear somebody countering with a lower offer? That is crazy, but that is so cool
yeah.
because it shows you that he it's kind of his way of like urging you to buy that house. And I've been to that house, and it's right off campus. I mean, it's
Mhm.
location wise, it's like a wonderful location, walking distance, even from so much closer than so many of those apartment buildings. So anyway, that is really cool.
Hmm. Yeah. One more quick story about the Lord providing for these dinners. Yeah, we would have the new international student orientation every year. The students would come to our house for lunch. And yeah, we would have a couple hundred in the backyard, and they would come in shifts. And so, the the university would have their orientation, and like a third of them would come to our house immediately after orientation for lunch. They would take a third of them and they would do a campus tour, and the tour would end at our house. So like the first couple hundred were done eating by the time the second group came up. And then those were grad students who needed to go to Ravenna to get their social security card. Yeah, they would arrive later. So they came in shifts. So that's partially how we were able to do that. um, but one of the cool things is it never rained on our picnic. Every year it forecasts rain, but it never rained on our picnic.
Yeah, and by the way, if it forecasts rain in Ohio, it's pretty almost a certainty because the typical forecast is overcast
Mhm.
and cloudy and overcast, but and it's again being in campus ministry, I planned so many events that have gotten rained out. Um, it's just very easy. It never rained. That's amazing.
And do you remember, oh, it's about 20 years ago, the blackout from from Detroit to Buffalo?
I vaguely,
There,
yes, yeah, like a electrical blackout.
yeah, there's electrical blackout for a week.
That happened on the day of your picnic.
It actually happened a few days before. And so that week I was going to the airport picking up students, and I was kind of arranging some things for the university because a lot of the students couldn't land in Cleveland because there was no power. So they were being rerouted to Toronto and other places. And so it was a wild week trying to figure out where the students were and getting them back there. But the interesting thing is, yeah, Kent was without power, as everything was from Detroit all the way to Buffalo, New York. The university still had their power generators, so they still had their orientation. We had power throughout that. Our house had power. All the neighbors were without power that week. And so not only did we host all these international students, but even all our neighbors came because they couldn't go to work. And so even our neighbors came to the picnic because they couldn't go to work because their work was without power, their houses were without power, but somehow our little house on the corner there never lost power.
That is amazing. I,
So
I did not know that story. That is crazy. That is crazy. Well, let's talk about like some individual lives, like, and I know you've got lots and lots of stories here, but um, again, maybe keeping people's names protected or whatever, their identities protected. But what are some of just share a couple stories of like how you saw God draw students to himself?
Hmm.
And then maybe those early days, or just some exciting moments. I know that you've baptized like lots and lots of students through the years.
Yeah.
So any testimonies like stand out to you?
Hmm. Well, okay. Let me sort through these in my head real quick. I mean, yeah, there we have literally seen hundreds of people come to know the Lord. And I, I owe a lot of that too, also not just what we were doing, but the people that the Lord put around us.
Hmm.
And I think I think one thing that really sticks out to me is the Chinese church. We started the Chinese church in 2001, and I think one of the interesting things was the people who had recently come to know the Lord were really committed to praying together. And we've had quite a few people come to the church to ask us to pray because they said you have a reputation that when you pray, the Lord answers your prayers. And people who are sick, people who are having children, and a lot of people praying, that either their spouses' visas would get approved or their parents' visas would be approved. That was one of the things that was different back then. When we started the ministry, we most of the scholars were older and many of them were married, but almost all of them were Communist Party members, and so most of them, their spouses were not allowed to come because that was the guarantee that they would return to China once they got their degree.
Mm.
And so, having people come to us and pray, have us pray that their spouse would get their visa. Yeah, we quickly got a reputation that the Lord answers the prayers of the Chinese church in Kent. And
Wow.
actually, I heard one student who was well, for a while he was the head of the Chinese Student and Scholar Association, and um he was planning a big picnic for one of their Chinese celebrations, one of the Chinese holidays. And one of the other students commented, he was not a believer at that point. But they asked him, they're like, well, what's your backup plan in case it rains? He says, oh, we're going to invite David because if David's coming, it's not going to rain on our picnic.
That's funny. And did you go?
I I did. Um, I'm not sure if I went to that one or not. To be honest, I don't
Yeah, you
remember.
don't remember. You don't
But
remember. That is pretty amazing. Yeah. If
but it's fun hearing the stories from other students that that saying this is what the other students say.
yeah. Yeah. Now, did you find that like the Chinese students that you worked with, was God at work in their hearts way before you met them? Like, were they already um kind of like seeking um
It I think it varied from over time. It we saw a huge difference over 25 years of ministry experience. As I mentioned, when we started the ministry, almost all the scholars that we worked with were in their 40s and 50s, and most of them, no, this was late 80s, early 90s, so most of them had grown up um, as a small child, been through the Cultural Revolution, and then during the 70s, well, they call it the lost generation because there was no education system for a while in China. And so, yeah, a lot of those people were had been through some very difficult times in China, and a lot of them were very disillusioned with the Communist Party. But they had been taught the Communist Party is everything. It's your religion, it's your philosophy, it's your political system, it's everything for to you. but they were disillusioned with that. And so they would say, no, we're just looking for something to believe in. And so they seemed very hard to convince. Um, but once they accepted Christ, they were completely sold out. And that's a big shift because like later, um, like towards the end of our time at Kent, we started seeing more undergrad students. And 25 years later, a lot of the ones who were coming as undergrads were there because their parents had money. And, you know, the people who came in the beginning, though, those were China's best and brightest. And a lot of the ones coming later, they came because their parents had money and they were spoiled and um, weren't always committed to their studies and really more postmodern in their thinking. And so, yeah, it was a different it was a different mode of ministry throughout that time. And as a scientist, I think one of the biggest shifts for me is like in the beginning, most of the people I worked with were scientists. And no, they're like, well, show me the evidence.
Yeah.
And so we would go through the scientific evidence. And they wanted evidence. They didn't want to talk about faith. And I think one of the big turning points was later in the ministry, working with some of these young kids. And as science progressed, it became there's much more evidence for a creator, intelligent design. The those arguments were much more developed, and just the volume of evidence for a creator um, has grown so much that instead of saying, "Show me the evidence, don't show me faith," they're like, "Well, yes, all the evidence points to there being a God, but we have faith that through time the humans will be able to come up for an answer without God." And I'm like, wow, so you're completely opposite. You're going against the evidence and relying on faith in humanity. And wow, that was a big shift to hear that. And it, it was it was shocking.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. Um, well, we're coming to the end of our time here. Any final thoughts you want to share related to the topic of faith or just something that we've touched on today?
Hmm. Yeah, I think for me, another point about when I found the money, I remember leading a Bible study about Jesus walking on water. And kind of one of the points that really struck out to me is Peter walked on water. And, he grew up his whole life. He was a fisherman. He grew up his life on the water. He never dreamed that he would walk on water. And I just remember asking the Lord, I'm like, what's the point that you want me to take away from this? And I was nervous about going into the ministry. I mean, I'm an introvert and um yeah, the idea of being a minister was scary. But I think the Lord used that to assure me. He says, don't worry about what you're going to do because you can't even imagine what you're going to do. I'm going to do things that are beyond your comprehension. And yeah, just thinking of myself as an introvert who never wants to be around crowds of people, I've never become fluent in Chinese, but not only has he used me to minister to thousands of students, seeing hundreds come to know the Lord, but he used me to plant a Chinese church, which I'm not fluent in Chinese. How am I supposed to start a Chinese church? But that's what he led me to do, and we did it, and the church is still going strong. We started IFC, which I think when we left Kent to go to Ohio State, we had, I think, 14 churches and almost 700 volunteers working with international students. And just the Lord has expanded on what he has called us to do. And yeah, it's not anything I would ever imagine. And so I, you know, was it Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. because our understanding and our vision is just so small. And again, going back to Ephesians, to him who's able to do immeasurably more than all you can ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus. And just the idea, if you can imagine it, it's too small. God says you can't even begin to imagine what I'm going to do. So trust me.
Well, thank you very much, David. I really appreciate it. It's fun to talk with you. I appreciate you sharing that, and may God use your stories to encourage people to trust God in a deeper way.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.